Hey everyone, this is your host Yoshino, and you're listening to episode number 172 of Decoded. In this episode, I had the pleasure to speak with social evolutionary psychologist William von Hippel. To give you some background on Bill, he is a professor at the University of Queensland, Australia, and has published more than 100 articles, chapters, and edited books on social psychology. His research has been featured in the New York Times, USA Today, The Economist, and the BBC, just to name a few. His most recent book, The Social Leap, is a blend of anthropology, biology, history, and psychology with an emphasis on evolutionary science. It's a fresh and provocative look at our species that provides new clues about who we are, what makes us happy, and how to use this knowledge to improve our lives. We talk about the relationship between explorations through observations, which can be analogous of the process of a scientist in comparison with an artist. And we also talk about how great ideas are at times found. And he was talking about how a majority of the time we tend to stumble upon good ideas, which is a hypothesis that I've been trying to think about and articulate for a while. I talk about this a bit, actually, back on episode 165 with musician Damian Kulash, if you want to go back through our catalog of episodes and check that one out. But this conversation really stood out to me because I found that there are a lot of overlaps between the studies of artists and of scientists, which you'll have to listen to in this episode. And this conversation really helped me contextualize that understanding a bit further as well. So I hope you enjoy it. But before we begin this episode, I want to remind everyone that we're going to be starting a Patreon soon. So please check back on that. And if you'd like to sign up for our newsletter, please email me at info@artistdecoded.com. And if you can, please go to our iTunes page, leave us a solid review, and it would be greatly appreciated. It helps reviewers just like yourself to hear about this podcast. So without further ado, here's my conversation with social evolutionary psychologist William von Hippel. So yeah, thanks for taking the time to be on the podcast. I really appreciate you for coming on board.
Of course, my pleasure.
Yeah, definitely. So right before this, we were talking about you moving over to Brisbane 20 years ago, and why initially did you have that decision to move over there?
So we had come over here on sabbatical about a little over 20 years ago. My wife and I had, and we just totally loved Australia. We were living in Sydney at the time, right down on Coogee Beach, and it was just such a magical place. And then we went back to the States where I was teaching at Ohio State University, which is a really lovely university. And, great colleagues, great students. But my wife didn't have a job there, and I'm pretty soft and weak. I wanted to get somewhere warmer. And then out of the blue, we get this email from Australia saying, hey, if you guys want to come back, we've got 2 jobs. So it took me about a nanosecond to decide, and we jumped for it.
Your area of study, has it always been within social evolutionary psychology?
So, no, this is actually a long-standing interest, but a relatively recent career shift. So when I started graduate school, started my Ph.D. program about 35 years ago, at the opening picnic, when all the grad students are meeting each other, meeting the professors, I met a professor named David Buss. He had just come to the University of Michigan from Harvard, where he had been a professor before, and now he's actually at the University of Texas. Buss is a very eminent evolutionary psychologist, and I didn't even know there was such a thing. Like, I'd literally never heard of it. And so we're chit-chatting at the picnic, and I ask him what he does, and he tells me about it. And I'm like, that is so wild. That is super interesting. But if I do that, I will never get a job. Like, my colleagues are not going to like that. And so I had lots of interests. And so I thought, well, let me go into straightforward social psychology, studying prejudice and stereotyping. Intergroup relations was my primary interest. And then down the road someday, when I've already been promoted and my colleagues' dissatisfaction won't disrupt my career, maybe I'll revisit this. And so after about 20 years in the field, I started to become dissatisfied with the way that I was understanding our current selves, because I didn't really understand where we came from. So, in psychology, we often ask questions like, well, what makes you happy? Or why is that persuasive? And the answer is often just, well, that improves your self-esteem, or it makes you feel good about yourself. It, enhances your reputation. But we never asked, well, why does that lead to happiness, or why is that persuasive? And in order to answer that question, I think you need to rewind the tape and look at where we came from and what factors were important for the survival and reproduction of our ancestors. So for maybe the last 12 to 15 years, I've taken a deep dive into that question of, so where were we in the past, and how does that help us understand where we are today?
Yeah, I like how your book, you take the history of where we've been, and I also like that you add personal stories into the text to be able to relate that back into like the historical evidence of certain things. For instance, you were talking about one of your kids, and I think it was in the beginning of the book when you were talking about that you and him were having a really good time. I think you were on the beach, and then you entered into the forest, and it started to get really dark, and just the almost, I want to say, the like illusion of fear, or the idea that fear could be lurking around the corner, or something that you should be afraid of. And there's something interesting about, the way that you string together various stories. Also, you were relating things such as social innovations versus technological innovations, and how, sometimes we use social innovations before the advent of certain technological innovations. And I really liked your book. I thought it was applicable to humanistic traits and values, which I really liked.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, that's what's so fun about this field, is that the interesting discoveries about our past literally inform us in our, random bits and bobs of everyday life. And so the example you gave is a good one, where in the book, I talked about how my son and I were walking on the beach, coming home at night back to our hotel, and we had to walk through a couple hundred yards of forest, which was a nothing, and we'd hardly noticed it during the day. But suddenly at nighttime, when it's dark and the woods close in around us, my son immediately got really scared. He was only 8 years old, so he wasn't old enough to rationally think, well, there's nothing here that could harm us. But this ancestral pressure that, are back a few million years ago, because our eyes work really well, but our ears and nose don't work so well. We're daytime animals. We rely on light. And nocturnal animals can eat us at night, even if they're the very same animals that we would eat during the day. So we've evolved to be afraid of the night. And you don't need to, it doesn't take any brain power. It doesn't take any planning. The second you feel it, you just feel scared. And so my son immediately went from super happy to super scared. And I tried to persuade him that it was all okay. But I have to admit that even inside me, even though I knew we were safe, I felt this sense of dread, just as this dark forest closed in around us. Our ancestors that didn't feel that sense of dread, well, they didn't end up as our ancestors because somebody ate them. And so it was only those of us, those ancestors in our past who had the sense to be scared of the dark that had the chance to pass on their genes.
So I have to ask, do you think that people are naturally lazy, or do you think we've essentially de-evolved to become lazy due to certain conveniences by technological innovations?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the thing is that you imagine life as a hunter-gatherer as one of really hard work, because every day your survival depends on digging up something to eat or hunting down something to eat. But in truth, hunter-gatherers work no harder than we do. They spend about 8 hours a day either hunting or mending tools or cooking. Like literally, when you add up their entire day, they've got about a good 8 hours of leisure before they're off to bed, which is probably better than what we've got. And so we feel lazy because, in fact, we're pampered. But that's not quite the same thing as laziness. We're pampered in the sense that when we want food, we go to the fridge or the pantry. When we're cold, we turn up the heat. We have all these wonderful luxuries that our ancestors couldn't have even dreamed of. But I suspect that we work as hard or harder than they did.
It's interesting. That's something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. I think it's very much embedded within Western culture to want to strive for something or to pursue something. I mean, even in the Constitution, this idea of happiness, it's something that needs to be pursued, and it's not something necessarily that is felt, as if we did not have happiness to begin with.
Yeah, that's a great point. And our ancestors would have found that idea confusing, that you pursue happiness. They would have thought, well, happiness is something that comes when your belly's full and when you're with the people that you care about and when you're safe. And they wouldn't have thought happiness is something I have to strive for. But it's partially, historians have argued that it's partially maybe came out of the Protestant work ethic and and this individualism ideas that, again, our ancestors were very collectivist. They didn't hold these strong individualism ideas. But it's also probably partially a function of that pampering that you discussed, that when you sit around and all your basic needs are met, not only today, but also tomorrow, well, you can start to ponder on the meaning of life and ponder on, am I really happy? And would I rather be doing this or that? Our ancestors never once asked themselves what they want to do for a living. They're hunter-gatherers. Their parents were, and their children were going to be for hundreds of thousands of years. Those who were us and who slowly segued into us did the same thing. And so if everybody does the exact same thing for a living and everybody has the exact same life activities, I don't think you ask these big questions about what's my purpose here and what should I be doing something different? Am I really expressing my passion? You just do what it takes to make a living, and then you hang out with your friends. And I think that sort of modern idea that we should pursue happiness rather than just achieving it as we go through life is a function of that. It's sort of this unfortunate freedom that, on the one hand, it's a great thing that you don't have to be a hunter-gatherer for a living, because if you're not good at hunting and gathering, you've got lots of other options now. But on the other hand, it opens up these kind of, I think, existential concerns and worries.
But do you think for those very reasons, that's because we have so many options at any given moment? I mean, you can literally go on your phone and spend the entire day on your phone looking up news or, going on Netflix or any of these options to entertain yourself. But do you think that's why people have a hard time being in the moment?
Yeah, so I do think that plays a role, is that we're not good anymore with boredom and with being on our own. So when I was a kid, there was no internet. These fancy things like phones, smartphones were imagined. I remember somebody telling me when I was, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 years old, that in the future, everybody would have their own phone number and a phone with them all the time. And I thought, why on earth would anyone want that? It just didn't occur to me that a phone would be more than just calling somebody and chatting with them. A phone was something in those days that you contacted a friend if you couldn't see them, or you arranged to get together with a friend, or you did some business. But it wasn't something that opened up this entire world to you like a smartphone does today. And so, I think that back then people were better about just being alone with their thoughts or being with their friends and sharing their thoughts. Whereas today, I think our standards of entertainment have risen because the world is so much more entertaining. My friends and I would get together and literally play Monopoly for hours. And if you think about that game, it's stunningly tedious. You're going around and around a circle, purely driven by luck. You buy properties if you can, and then you charge people who lend them. There's no skill, there's nothing going on there. And now if you look at the games that are available just on your phone, much less in all the other places in the world, they're 10 million times more interesting. And so it's no wonder that thing captures our attention. And it makes sense that it does. Again, though, the downside is that if somebody asks you, what do you want to do for a living, or how do you want your life to be? Nobody says, well, I want to have this life where I spend all my time on my phone playing games. We expect to find this something more meaningful in our existence. We expect to find this passion where we can contribute. And we've evolved to want to contribute to our group because, if we weren't more of an asset to our group than a liability, chances are good that we'd wake up one morning and we'd be left behind. And that was a death sentence. So it's important to us as individuals that we feel valued by our group. And it's hard to feel valued by your group if your life's ambition is to play lots of fun games on your phone. We try to seek our passion and find it. And my experience has been that my students really struggle if they don't know what that passion is. They feel that they're being left out, that there's something wrong, that they can't find it. When in truth, I think probably most of us stumble upon our passion, unless we're stunningly gifted in a particular domain, in which case our passion finds us. I think that we wander for a long time looking for what we want to do.
Yeah, I've been thinking about just this idea too about how great ideas are more so found. And then well, actually, you know what? Maybe you can answer this, because in your book, you do talk about certain genetic traits that we have, and then also our decisions play a huge role into what we do, and also sexual selection and those sort of things. But, because there's so many options out there, we take an idea such as like a dating app, for instance. And speaking of sexual selection, and the options are so much more open to us. So do you feel that because of all those options, it plays into the reasons why people are unhappy?
Well, there's two things going on there. One, I think, options themselves are fundamentally good. And so, like, for example, there's some interesting data that showed that romantic partnerships, marriages, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever it is, that start on the internet tend to be more stable and long lasting than ones that meet in person now. So that's a kind of remarkable finding if it proves to be true over the long run, that we're better at finding partners on the internet than we are in finding them in real life. And if that proves to be true, which the early data suggests it is, then what I suspect is going on is that it's just because the internet provides you so many more options. If you think about the number of people that you can meet in your everyday life who are suitable for your taste with regard to age and gender and all that sort of thing, you can instantly multiply that by 1,000 or even 10,000 if you hop on to a dating app on the web. So if finding the right person is a matter of just trolling through this haystack looking for a needle, well, that suggests that you're going to do a better job when you have lots of options. So in that sense, I think options are a really good thing. But there are two ways in which options are a bad thing. The first way in which options are a bad thing is that when particularly people who engage in what's called maximizing, which is they're trying to find the best possible choice, that's contrasted to satisficing, which is when you're looking for the first choice that's good enough. So maybe, you're looking for a hotel in a new city, and if you're a maximizer, you look at all the hotels and all the ratings and you pick the best one you can afford. If you're a satisficer, you have in mind it needs to have these 4 qualities, and as soon as you find the first hotel with those qualities, boom, you make your reservation. Well, it turns out that maximizers make better decisions than satisficers, which not that surprising given that, they put a lot more effort into it, but they're actually less satisfied with their decision. And the problem is that they know all the possible choices that were out there, and any final choice you have to make, unless you're a billionaire, is going to be loaded with compromises. And so they're sad about all the foregone opportunities. And so in that sense, choice is a really bad thing. The more choice we have, the more opportunities that we have to forego. And that makes us unhappy. But there's another sense that's probably even more important, where I would say choice is a bad thing. And that's kind of a more fundamental sense about what choice even means. So if you go back to pre-Copernicus and pre-Darwin, nobody questioned the existence of this higher power. Nobody questioned that the earth was the center of the universe. And that meant that, well, whatever I'm doing, God has a plan for me, and I'm just enacting that plan, and I don't need to search for a meaning to my existence because my existence fundamentally has meaning. I'm part of this big fabric of planned existence. Well, now post-Copernicus and post-Darwin, we now understand that we're kind of random flotsam and jetsam that on a trivial planet in a trivial solar system of one of a gazillion galaxies. And having your nose rubbed in the meaningless of your existence is really hard. You now have a choice. How do I find meaning in my life? And some people can arrive at that choice really easily, and some people find that an impossible task because at one level our life doesn't really have meaning. At one level our life is just something that happened. And so in that sense, the opening up of science and all that comes with it has actually been, I think, quite costly for human happiness, and at least the sort of existential side of struggling for meaning in our existence.
Something I wanted to ask you is about coronavirus, and essentially a lot of people, especially in the United States, have to be self-isolated. But can you tell me how big of a detriment it is to be in self-isolation, assuming that we have evolved to become collaborative social beings?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because self-isolation is, in principle, a horrible thing. It's something that we evolved to avoid at all costs. When we're with our group out there in the savannah, we're safe. We can protect ourselves from predators, because we're really good at working together, and we can also protect ourselves from other groups who are also really good at working together. When we're alone, we're at risk of dying. And so we evolved this strong aversion to being alone, because those ancestors who didn't mind being alone, well, they got picked off. And so they end up not being our ancestors after all. Only the ones who have quite an affinity for being with their group are the ones who are likely to pass on their genes and therefore that tendency. So on the one hand, being alone is absolutely not what we've evolved to do. But the fact that this pandemic hit now and not 35 years ago allows us to be alone in a way that's much more palatable for us, because it's so easy to get online and not only have an audio conversation with people that we care about, but see them at the same time. And so we just pick up our phone or our computer and we Zoom and to see and talk to the people that we care about. Now, it's not perfect. There's some very interesting ways that when people are in person, they synchronize lots of aspects of their vocal tone, and even their pupils synchronize. So people's bodies come into tune with each other when they can talk in person. And because there's no technology between them, they're really good at interleaving back and forth in the conversation. And that's not so easy to do once you introduce technology and inevitable delays and people accidentally interrupt and things like that. So I'm not saying that the socializing goes as well when it's not in person, but it's a whole lot better than none. And then, of course, the other side is that we also evolved a strong importance for touch. When humans are hugging each other in close contact with those they care about, they release oxytocin. It's a bonding chemical, and that plays a big role in our socializing with people who are really meaningful and important to us. And if they're not in your home with you and you can't do that, it diminishes the connection that we have. And so it's unpleasant, it's psychologically unhealthy, and over the long term, it's even potentially damaging of relationships. Now, I suspect that COVID will, once it releases and we're able to go back to the ways we were, we'll probably be a little bit more paranoid about hygiene. But I think there's going to be a lot of reconnecting, and there won't be any long-term costs from these things. But in the meantime, it's going to make people sad and anxious.
Why do you think people have an issue with being present? And why do you think that there are many books upon the subject of being present? And why do you think people have an issue being present?
That's a great example of evolutionary trade-offs. And so, whenever evolution gives us a new ability, there's almost guaranteed to be new costs that come with that ability. And so in this particular case, human beings are the only animal on this planet, to the best of our knowledge, who can envision a world of unfelt needs. And so what I mean by that is I can envision a world tomorrow or even in 10 minutes where I might feel differently from the way I feel now. Now, a chimpanzee can envision the immediate future, but it can't envision feeling differently. So, for example, if a chimpanzee is hungry and there's a termite mound over there, it'll go over to a bush, it'll break off a branch, it'll strip off the leaves, and now it's got a tool for fishing out termites by stuffing the stick into the mound and then licking the termites off it. Little fishing rod, so to speak. The problem is that when the chimpanzee's done eating termites, it can't ever imagine that it'll need that tool again, because right now it's full and it literally can't imagine a world in which it's hungry, despite the fact that it's going to be hungry again very soon. And so it'll throw the stick away. And we know that also from lots of experiments done in the laboratory, that they can't imagine a world where they don't feel as they do now. Well, if you can't imagine a world where you don't feel as you do now, what it also means is that you can't plan for anything, because you can't envision a world where you don't feel exactly the way you do today. You can't start to build these sort of nested scenarios that we as humans rely on when we're planning. Tomorrow I'm going to try to do X in order to get that promotion, or I'll try to meet that person who I really have a crush on, or whatever. And then we start making these elaborate plans in our mind. So if a chimpanzee wants to try to do something, wants to achieve a goal, it literally has to enact that goal and see how it goes. Now, think about the huge advantage that we have as humans, where we can imagine trying to enact a goal. And then as we get 12 steps down the plan, we suddenly go, oh no, that's not going to work at all. And we can now back up and rewind the plan back to step 4 and then start going forward again until we perfect it. That's so much safer than giving it a try and seeing what happens. So here's the thing. It's an enormous gift that evolution gave us, this capacity to plan for the future, to envision unfelt needs. But it comes with huge costs as well. One of those costs is that our mind is constantly forward in the future, because that's what serves us so well. And so we're constantly thinking back to the past of how we might have improved it and forward to the future of how we might make it better. With the cost, that means that it's difficult for us to lock our mind in the present. Now, that inability to lock our mind in the present is costly for happiness. Think about the last time that you, for example, had some really tasty dessert. Tasty desserts are almost by definition unhealthy. So you probably knew this isn't something I should eat too much of, but I really want a piece of chocolate cake or a brownie or ice cream or whatever. And so I'm going to eat it. Well, if you're like me, you're really enjoying the first few bites, and then literally your mind starts to wander and you're barely even enjoying what you're eating anymore, as you're thinking about tomorrow or thinking about what just happened yesterday, and you're not focused on this ice cream or dessert or whatever it is that you're eating. And so this wonderful gift that evolution gave us, unfortunately, tends to kick itself into gear all the time and making it very difficult for us to enjoy the present. Now, our dogs have no trouble with that. Chimpanzees have no trouble with that. They enjoy the present in a huge way. But of course, their complete lack of ability to plan for tomorrow means that we're living in these wonderful climate-controlled environments and we are in control of our future, and they're not.
Do you think that because we have memories of the past, like have you done any studies on the fallibility of memories? how memories change over time. And I think you even talked about this in your book about how people have become or have evolved to become self-deceptive beings.
Yep. Yep, absolutely. So memory is highly fallible, and it actually, we think of that as an imperfection, but it's actually evolved to be fallible. It's evolved to rely on things that we think about the most. It's evolved to rely on things that seem to be the most important at the time. I actually had a grandfather with an eidetic memory, what we call a photographic memory. And I remember somebody referring to it as he was cursed by a perfect memory because he couldn't get anything out of his head. And so, for example, if I asked you for your phone number and you started to tell me and he didn't ever need to call you, he'd literally close his ears so he wouldn't have yet one more phone number bouncing around in his head. And so it's actually a plus that we can kind of forget the stuff that's not important and that we don't need. But of course, it's costly when we forget something important. Now, with regard to the issue around self-deception, we take advantage of our own memory fallibility to reconstruct our memory later. And so we tend to remember the things that make us look good. We tend to misremember our misbehavior so that either our misbehavior wasn't as extreme as it was, or maybe our motives were more pure than they seemed. We tend to guide our self-impression to be more positive than it really is. Now, on the one hand, you could say, well, we do that to feel better about ourselves because, of course, it does make you feel better. But in truth, what the data suggests is that we do this in order to manage the impression that other people have of us. If you and I got in some conflict in the past and I acted like a schmuck, now the next time I see you, I can maybe convince you that I wasn't really that much of a schmuck if I've misremembered my own behavior a little bit. Or more importantly, maybe I'll never convince you because you saw me behaving as I did, but I can convince others that you're really more to blame and I'm less to blame. So if we can deceive ourselves into believing that we're something better than we really are, then we're well placed to deceive others that we're also something better than we really are.
So then do you think that, speaking of self-deceptiveness and also just trying to convince other people and state our case on, certain actions that we took in the past and maybe make someone believe that we didn't do something out of ill will, but it was actually because of a specific reason. So in terms of sociopathy, do you think that humans are naturally sociopathic, or do you think that that has evolved over time in order for us to state our case about a specific thing? Yeah, I'm curious what you think.
So we definitely, all of us contain the sociopathic element of trying to manipulate others, because that's what self-deception really is all about. Finding, turning myself not into just the regular Bill that I am, but Bill who's 20% better, because that Bill plus 20% is going to get women to go out with me who wouldn't otherwise. I'm going to get guys to join my team when they're really better off not joining my team. And I'll even get some people to back down in conflict who could really crush me. So if I can believe I'm Bill plus 20, I can manipulate the world to favor me. And similarly with persuasion, if I can convince you that my vision of reality is an accurate one, if I can implant my goals in your mind, well, then I'm going to be a much bigger success because you're going to go out there and try to achieve things that benefit me. So in that sense, we're all a little bit sociopathic. But sociopathy is also a lack of guilt, a lack of shame, a lack of these negative self-conscious emotions where once we've harmed others, we feel bad. And that's actually a bad thing. That actually makes you less successful in life. It helps you in the short term because you can ruthlessly manipulate other people and not feel bad about what you're doing and then exploit them and move on. But it harms you in the long run because eventually your reputation catches up with you. Now, in our ancestral environment, it caught up with you very quickly because you're surrounded by a very small group of people. In today's world, people often try to escape. The sociopaths try to exploit and move on. But now the internet is starting to catch up with them, and it's kind of recreating that ancestral world where all these reputation buttons that we have with Uber and eBay and Airbnb and all those things make it hard to be a sociopath. I would add, though, that it's also hard to be a sociopath in the sense that if they don't feel guilt when they harm an important relationship, if they don't feel shame, well, then they're constantly misbehaving and other people just don't want to be around them. And so we're way better off with this capacity to feel guilt. So when we harm someone who means something to us, we repair that relationship. When we envision engaging in a shameful behavior, we decide not to, even if that's what we want to do, because we don't want that reputational cost. So we've evolved to be non-sociopathic because it benefits us. Being able to envision other people's reactions to us and then internalizing those negative reactions from others, that makes sure that we behave ourselves and keep our group happy. And all we really do with that self-deception is we skirt around the edges and we try to sell ourselves as something a little bit more than we are. We try to manipulate people a little bit, but all of that's in the context of fundamentally being kind and cooperative with them.
So then do you think that we've evolved to become more empathetic human beings?
We have a very strong sense of empathy. We are very good at casting ourselves into other people's minds and taking their perspective and feeling as they feel. And sometimes we feel that too much. The other day, my wife had been reading about all the protests in the States, but she had not seen any of the video. And the other day I showed her this compilation video of all these crackdowns on innocent, peaceful protesters. I was showing her all these overreactions by these federal forces and by different police forces. And she just started to cry. She doesn't know a single one of those people, but she couldn't help but feel sad for all that's going on, right? And so empathy has costs. You don't want to make yourself upset by all the bad things that are going on in the world. And even though our world is so much of a better place than it used to be, and it's more peaceful, it's more friendly, it's richer, there's far fewer people in poverty, there's far more people who have autonomy in all ways imaginable. The world's better than it was the day I was born, it's better than it was 100 years ago, and it's better than it was 1,000 years ago. But it's still a place where lots of bad things happen. I mean, that's just inevitable. Nature and human nature has a lot of amoral features to it, and a lot of power structures and a lot of bad things. And so too much empathy will just make you feel sad all day. So again, all these abilities and traits are their double-edged swords. They help you become a more effective human. They help you interconnect with others, but also can make you feel really bad.
It's interesting talking to you because, I've kind of made this, it's almost like a self-challenge and part of my interest in neuroplasticity to be able to talk to people within more like science-based fields, because the majority of the time I'm talking to people that are within the arts. And something about talking specifically to people within the arts is that I feel like that there's this confirmation bias, because a lot of the times people within the arts know other people within the arts, and there's similar conversations that are going in those circles, right?
Well, nobody is better than artists at communicating emotion. And what that suggests to me, and I don't know the data on this, but it suggests to me that artists probably on average feel stronger emotions than most people, feel more empathic than most people. And that's why their motivation is to communicate that emotional tenor. So when you see a great painting or hear a great symphony or any aspect of the arts, it immediately speaks to you in a way that other things don't. And what it's doing is it's speaking to you on this emotional level. And that's what empathy is all about. Now, what that tells you, of course, is a lack of empathy would make it super hard to appreciate the arts. But it also tells you, like everything else that we're discussing, it's not an unmitigated good. Lots of artists are unhappy for long periods of time, in part because of that strong sense of empathy.
But I also think that, yes, I do agree that it's part of that strong sense of empathy, but I also feel that also follows, the patterns of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for instance, that a lot of artists are suffering financially in this economic system that we live in. And because of that, if you're always trying to reach that highest point of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and reach that point of self-actualization, and that is your purpose for life, or that's what you feel is your purpose for life, but you're constantly struggling on the bottom and trying to figure out your survival needs, you'll never really get there.
Yeah,
right?
look, no, I totally agree. It's super hard to be in any of the arts because so few people can make a financial success of it, be it music or the visual arts or any of the wide variety of arts. The internet helps because you can get discovered. You don't have the gatekeepers anymore, but it's still obviously a super difficult life. I love photography. I have no manual dexterity for the arts, but I love photography, and I would have loved to have been a photographer. But I thought, I'm never going to make it. I'm going to spend my life in a mall photographing babies, and I'm just not going to enjoy that life. I'm never going to be able to take the pictures I want to do. So I never pursued that possibility, and I'm sure I wasn't good enough. And so that's the super unfortunate side. But I would say that the problem goes well beyond that. So if you take, for example, Picasso, my family and I had the good fortune. We were on sabbatical in Europe, and we were traveling around at the end of the time that we were there. And we went through Madrid, and we stopped at the museum, and we saw Guernica. And we happened to go into the room when there was nobody else in there. That's this enormous, stunning painting. And so I wanted my kids to see it and appreciate it. So we all sat down and started looking at it and talking about it. And it was nice that we could talk without, disturbing other people, because we were just the only ones in the room. Well, the longer you look at that, the more you realize that I feel like, I could be wrong, but I feel like Picasso would have suffered a lot as he made that painting, as he's feeling what the people are feeling in that town as it's being bombed. And everybody else would read the newspaper and they'd feel really upset about that town that's being bombed. And then they would go back to their own life and whatever it is that they have to deal with, and that those thoughts would pass. But as an artist who's spending your time trying to convey what happened there, well, suddenly that becomes your project, right? And you have to take a deeper dive into that kind of unpleasantness. And by the time he painted that, he was already a super important artist. So I would say that even the highly successful artists, we have this belief that success is going to bring us happiness. And as you point out, it will certainly allow us to focus on other kinds of needs. But that's not completely clear to me that that's true. I often think if you talk to artists, even really, really successful ones, some of them will probably tell you that the most exciting times they had when they were young and trying to make it, rather than when they were established and had already made it.
But I also think that that's more of a humanistic characteristic as well. I think that, you even talk about it in this book that we've developed certain evolutionary traits. For instance, you said about the two people that are pondering killing the mastodon. And once they both, and maybe the whole group kills the mastodon, that one of the guys is essentially living in the past and keeps on thinking about, I killed this mastodon, and that was something that they have a fond memory about. But the other person is constantly on the hunt and trying to kill more mastodons and has that drive within them. And then I think like the challenge is constantly, once you get to that goal, and I feel like this is a humanistic thing, is to be able to constantly want to reinvent yourself and to get to new goals. And I have this kind of, I would call it a social theory, but that what I call is like the childlike sensibilities. And whenever I look at the artwork of a child, they're not really, they're so, I'm making a generalization, but they're so focused on that specific moment. They're not really thinking about how to sell it, or how to, where it's going to go, or anything like that. So I think, so maybe, over time, where do you find that inspiration to be able to continue discovering?
Yeah, look, it's got to be really hard. And the artists in that sense are like scientists or plumbers or bricklayers or anybody else, in the sense that we all need tomorrow's accomplishment, because we evolved to get happy when we achieve what we're hoping to achieve, and then we evolved to return to baseline, exactly as you were discussing. So any ancestors who became permanently happy were no longer motivated, and they would be left behind because they're just living in the past. But any of our ancestors who could get happy when they achieved something were motivated to achieve. But then if that happiness dissipated, they were re-motivated to achieve. And so that's how our emotion of happiness evolved. And I do think that it's a guarantee to make it so that we are constantly trying to achieve something new. And if you're an artist, you're probably trying to find your muse and try to find new inspiration and new insight for your next project. And if you're a scientist, you're trying to figure out your next hypothesis. And if you're a bricklayer, you're trying to figure out how to build your next house. And all those tasks are super important. But at the same time, in all those cases, it's really nice on reflection to be able to go back and say to yourself, wow, I've really built a lot of great houses, or I've really done some interesting work in the sciences, or I've really painted some paintings or built some sculptures, or whatever you've done that make me proud, that make me feel like I've accomplished something, that I've added to the greater human good. And so on the one hand, I do believe that we keep returning to baseline. But on the other hand, I do also think that it's nice to be able to reflect on our past and the contributions we've made. And I guess what I think makes it particularly hard if you're an artist is that part of what you're doing in your contribution is trying to communicate emotion. And often those emotions aren't positive ones. And that will require you as the artist to wallow in negative things in a way that a scientist or a bricklayer or somebody else just doesn't do.
But do you think, specifically speaking of science, do you think that's because there's a certain layer of objectivity and it's within the certain constraints of a lab, testing things out either, on the field or in a lab?
That actually does provide a protective layer, so to speak. And it's also the case that if you're a scientist who works on humans, then you're probably actually personally invested in the answer. We like answers that are good for us, that promote human longevity and happiness. We don't like answers that are bad for us, that suggest things aren't so, that humans are violent or selfish or evil. And so we all have preferred ways that we want the answer to come out when we're studying the human condition. And so it can be upsetting if your data tell you, well, humans are fundamentally tribal and it's going to be really hard to make prejudice go away. Or human beings are fundamentally selfish and it's hard to get them to think about others, whatever your data might tell you. So I do think that there is an objectivity, but there's also sometimes some results are much more preferred over others. And that's an ongoing problem in this across the entire social sciences, is how our preferences and ideology can get in the way of our objectivity. And science solves that problem by being antagonistic, by being adversarial. And so when I publish a result that suggests that humans are this way, maybe they really are that way, but maybe it's just that's how I want them to be. So I've misconstrued my own data. Well, somebody on the other side is going to say, no, hold on, I don't buy that. And they're going to run a contrary experiment and try to show that it's the opposite. And so in the end, even though individual scientists are just as fallible as every other individual on this planet, science itself is wonderfully self-correcting. Not always in the short term. Sometimes it could take way longer than we'd like. But because we always are adversarially working against each other, in the end, I do believe the truth wins out pretty much every time, even if it, like I said, can take longer than we'd like. Some scientists have said you really need the old generation to die out before you can accept the new truth, just because they're unwilling to change their mind. And again, that's human nature. But that gives us some advantage. But I think another advantage is that what we're doing also, our goal isn't conveying emotions, right? Our goal isn't conveying feelings. Our goal is just to learn something. And learning is something fundamental that all humans want to do. We have evolved to be a species that relies on learning more than any other species on this planet. And so in order to make that work, we've also evolved to enjoy learning. And so in that sense, I feel like I've got the perfect job. Every day I go out there and try to learn something new, and it's good fun, right? So I don't have, if I were a great artist and I was trying to take pictures of people who are maybe struggling or maybe victims of injustice or whatever, I think I would inevitably take some of that home with me.
But do you think that science and the arts are really that much different? I mean, essentially you're creating experiments and you're testing it out on the field, or, even for instance, you were talking about in your book how you went to the skate park and you were trying to understand if there was a spike in testosterone among males when they would be tested by, I guess you hired like a beautiful intern or something, right?
Yep.
To go out into the field with you. And then so you had one person going out and testing and asking them questions about how to do a trick. And then you had another person who's this beautiful female intern out there asking the same questions. And then you tested their saliva afterwards to find if there was a spike in the testosterone, right?
Well, I see where you're going. Those experiments are good fun. Like there's a little bit of an art in designing them so they're entertaining, they're fun to read about, and so that you create this reality for people out there in the lab or out there in the field that allows you to test what you want to test. And in that case, we wanted to see if the presence of an attractive female would lead to a spike in testosterone, which would lead to greater risk taking, meaning more crash landings. And sure enough, it did. And that was one of my students at the time, Richard Rone. That was his dissertation. It was a really wonderful idea that largely he gets the credit for. And it's good fun to sit down. We had a great time hashing out, designing that experiment, because it does have this sort of creative element of a bit like what you guys do in the arts. And so, yes, in that sense, there's a lot of overlap between what we do as scientists and what artists do. But of course, when we do that, we're trying to create a situation. We're trying to emulate something that happens in the real world so that we can take a small piece of it and study it. And so, yes, it has a creative element, and that's super satisfying. But I do think that creative element comes from a very different place and has a different purpose. And therefore, I think it doesn't have the same kind of emotional impact that I suspect. Look, I don't mean to say it's all negative being an artist at all. Obviously, when you're conveying positive emotions, things like awe and connection and all that, that also then is sitting in your mind the entire time you're creating the piece that you're working on. And that's got to be uplifting. So I'm not saying that it's pure cost to be an artist by any means. I'm just saying that artists, I think, take deeper dives into emotions than almost anybody else does, because that's literally their job. And so I suspect that their day-to-day experiences are more emotional than most other people's.
Definitely. Yeah. I think that, something while I was reading your book is that I found that, you're taking your observational studies and also personal stories from your real life experiences. And that's essentially what artists do as well. But maybe they're telling it in more of an emotionally palpable way. But I don't think that there's really a huge difference, especially in how much energy that people put towards their work, whether it's within the science and within the arts. Because I mean, the sciences and the arts are essentially exploring things of the unknown.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. We have the same job in one sense. We just go about it different ways. We're trying to discover and understand. Artists and scientists probably spend the same amount of hours at work on average, even though their work might look very different and their training to get there might look very different. The end result, though, is probably very similar in that regard. That all of us, again, we evolved to want to contribute to our community. And so whether you're an artist or a scientist, the way to contribute is to do good work. And then you can go home satisfied. You earn your night's repose, right? You can watch TV or get on your phone or have a lovely dinner with your family, whatever it is that you're trying to do. Now, on average, I think scientists have a big advantage over artists in the sense that the starving artist is literally this well-known, almost cultural cliche, and the starving scientist is not. And the job market for a scientist is much better because people understand what they're producing and they want to consume it. And the job market for artists is very top heavy. I mean, it's very focused on the top, where if you're one of the greats, things are fantastic. And if you're not, it's a struggle. And I'm not saying it's not a struggle in the early days of a scientist, because in fact, that's still very true, especially if you want to go into academics and be a professor. I saw a recent survey by the Royal Society in the UK that only 1 out of 200 PhDs ever becomes a full professor in the sciences. I'm not sure if that's true overall, but it's nonetheless definitely true that most people, it's hard to get jobs. There's 100 applicants for every academic position. And so graduate students are definitely like starving artists. They're getting by on very little. But if they decide that they want to leave academics, there's lots of jobs in industry where almost everyone in the sciences can earn a very good living.
Yeah, it seems that would make sense. It seems that the sciences are much more so supported by various systems in place, whether that be educationally or whether that be for a corporation or something, as opposed to the field within arts, and even film is suffering right now. Well, not right now. I mean, I think film will continue to suffer because there's just so many more options out there for people to watch various things or to get entertained by other things aside from film.
Yeah. So that's, I would agree with that. It's that everybody loves the arts, but it's easy to say, well, what that means is I'm going to read Harry Potter, I'm going to watch Star Wars, I'm going to go to the Louvre and enjoy these incredibly important paintings, and all the rest I don't really care about because I don't understand them or I struggle to appreciate them. And the beauty is that even people who say, I have no idea how that Mars rover works, they are still thrilled with the thousands and thousands of engineers who are doing all the little bits and bobs that it takes to make something that incredible work, or even just to make the internet work, or to make improve your phone or your heat system in your house, anything. We all just understand that, that stuff helps me. I'm happy that that's supported.
So after writing this book, what sort of things piqued your interest directly after and then subsequently, like within the more recent span of time?
So the book, what's been really fun for me about the book is that all the writing that I usually do is for my fellow academics. And so I'll write, usually they're very short papers, they're usually full of statistics, and they're designed to be hard to read. I mean, we don't mean for them to be hard to read, but they literally are. When I first started the field, I couldn't understand them. And so they're full of jargon, they're full of stats, and we're talking to each other and arguing about what the rest of the world would regard as minutia, trivial, tiny little points as we slowly build this edifice that is our scientific understanding of human nature. And it's a super slow process. It involves thousands and thousands of experiments. Many turn out to be wrong later, but of course, in the end, the ones that are right have value and those ideas keep being used. But then writing the book allowed me to suddenly rethink what I'm trying to do and talk about this to other people, to try to find a way to just tell the story to people in general. And that's actually what I do in the classroom. My job is both research and teaching. And so I really enjoy the classroom. I really love telling these stories. And so it allows you to sit back and say, well, what do I think this stuff really means? And which of these studies are really important? And which of them are, probably comparatively trivial? And so you start painting in much broader brushstrokes. And that's been a lot of fun. And then the consequence of the book is podcasts like this one and like lots of other ones and talks and various things where I get an opportunity to communicate about how we study human nature to people who otherwise had never encountered it before. For example, I've been doing a lot of work with the Australian Army and talking to, soldiers. And there, in the past, I never had this opportunity before to talk about our work and how it might be relevant to them. So it's lots of different audiences that are fun to get to know, that are interested in the work, in all of the science of human nature, but from different angles. And they get me thinking about it differently because then they ask questions that have literally never occurred to me. And sometimes we don't know the answer. And that sparks me thinking, boy, we should be doing experiments to find that out. And sometimes it gets me to think about old studies in new ways because they look at it through different eyes. So all that process for me has been a ton of fun. It's got to be a little bit like putting your stuff up in the gallery and then getting the public's reaction and interfacing with the public in ways and being asked questions and having people have ideas that you never thought of when you were originally creating the work.
True. Yeah. Well, I think with you, it seems like the thing that is the driving force is this innate sense of curiosity. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so much fun to figure out how humans work.
Well, seriously, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this podcast and to answer some of my questions on various existential ideas. And I really enjoyed your book. I think the way that you strung everything together with your various stories and also relating that back into scientific and historical knowledge, I thought was really nicely tied in together. And it was a great read.
Well, thanks. I'm delighted to hear it. And it's been great fun chatting with you. Again, this is a perfect example. I don't have that many opportunities to talk with artists about these sorts of things. So it's just fun for me to do so.
Well, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Sure. My pleasure. Right.
Music for the podcast is by Rarebit, aka Justin Dosher Hopkins. Editing assistance is by Noah Wainwright, and intern is Sam King.